Next up, we have Mr. Jeff Ebbeler. Jeff's been creating art for children for almost 20 years. He's illustrated and occasionally written over 50 picture books. Jeff graduated from the Art Academy of Cincinnati. He does a monthly comic series called Nestor's Doc for Ask Magazine. He worked as an art director for a children's book publisher in Chicago, and he's also done paper engineering for the pop-up books. He's also created large-scale murals for schools and churches, and even sculpted wooden puppets. Jeff gives many lectures and demonstrations at grade schools, colleges, and even museums. He and his wife currently live in Cincinnati with their twin daughters, Olivia and Isabel. Today, Jeff is going to show us the creative process of writing and illustrating one of his books. He'll talk about the things that inspire his stories, his personal stages of revising, sketching, painting, that go into the process of creating a finished picture book. And he'll give us a sneak peek into the development of his new kids graphic novel series. And so I'm going to turn it over to Jeff now. I will remind you kids, though, to make sure you keep asking questions, because you guys have done a really great job so far in this session, and we'll get as many of them answered as we possibly can. So, hi, Jeff. How are you?
Hi. Thanks, Andrew. I'm really excited to be here today. I'm sad that I can't come to the Buckeye Book Fest this year. It's one of my favorite things that I get to do every year. I've been going to the Buckeye Book Fest for about 10 years now. I live in Cincinnati, so it's nice, you know, once a year to get to go up to Worcester and to meet a lot of the authors and illustrators that live in Northern Ohio, and also meet a lot of the teachers and librarians that live up there. And because of that, I've gotten to do a lot of school visits in the Toledo and Cleveland area, so that's been really great. So today we're going to be talking about illustration, and I'm going to share my screen real quick. We'll get that going. Okay, so we're going to start off. These are the two books that I have out this year. One is called The One and Only Dylan St. Clair. It's written by Cayman Edwards. And the other one is called A Feast of Peas, written by Kashmira Sheth. And so I'm going to talk about those books, and I'm going to talk about some other books that I've been working on recently, some things that I have going on that I just started, and talk about the whole process. But before we do that, I want to do like a little shameless plug real quick. I want to show you guys, I've been working on a video series. So for any of the younger kids, if you guys want to watch like a story time video, I've got one done. I'm going to be putting out a bunch more. They're going to be me reading stories and also doing some art activities and some craft activities. So I'm going to show you a little tiny clip of that real quick, just so you can get a taste of what it's going to be like. My name is Jeff Ebbeler, and welcome to Art and Stories, brought to you by Happen Inc. I'm an author and an illustrator. I've illustrated chapter books, I do a comic series, and I've also written and illustrated a lot of picture books. Today, I am going to be reading a story called George the Hero Hound. Okay, so if anybody wants to check that out, you can go to the facebook.com/Happen Inc. Happen Inc. is a great organization in Cincinnati. They do lots of art classes for kids. So I've been really happy to work with them and do these videos with them. It's been a lot of fun. So we're talking about illustration today. I've been drawing my whole life. I've loved to draw. That's something I've always really loved to do. And a lot of that comes from this lady. This is my mom. Back when my mom was in college, she's a sculptor. She did lots of sculptures in bronze and in clay, and she taught me everything I know about drawing. I come from kind of an artistic family. My older brother, well, my oldest brother does photography and video. My sister does ballet. My other older brother does, he's really good at drawing. And so I was always trying to draw as well as my older brother did. And that's really what got me starting to draw. I was always practicing and practicing drawing because I wanted to draw as well as my brother did. So you can see that's the sculpture that my mom was working on. That's when she did it in clay. And this is when it was finished. It's a bronze crucifix that's hanging in a church at the College of Mount St. Joe's. And so my mom made a lot of art, but she was also a really great art teacher. And so when I was a kid, my mom taught art at the grade school I went to. And so when I was in about 6th grade, I'd always loved drawing, and she had taught me to draw lots of things, mostly from life. If any of you are interested in learning how to draw better, I think that the best way to learn how to draw is to draw things from real life. So if you want to learn how to draw animals, draw pictures of your cat or your dog. If you want to learn how to draw people, sketch pictures of your friends or look in the mirror and try drawing yourself. So I've been doing that for a long time, learning how to draw well and practicing a lot. But when I was in 6th grade and my mom was our art teacher, she gave us this assignment where we were supposed to make up a story and draw some pictures for the story. And then we went down to the kindergarten class and we read our stories to them. And so this is what I did back in 6th grade. This is called Marvin's Marvelous Mission. And it's about this boy who builds a giant robot to fight a slime monster. And you'll see as we go on, I kind of still like drawing the same things. I like drawing monsters. I like drawing robots and aliens and things like that. And so it's great that something that I love to do back in 6th grade is something that I get to do as a job now. So when I did this project, it was the first time I'd ever tried to tell a story with pictures, which is a little bit different than, you know, just drawing maybe a picture of a cat or a picture of a person. There might be a little bit of a story in it, but when you're trying to illustrate a story, you're trying to tell more of the story. You're trying to have the characters in your pictures tell part of the story. And that's the first time I'd ever tried to do anything like that. And after I worked on this project way back in 6th grade, I started really paying attention to the comic books I was reading and the cartoons I was watching on TV. I started making up my own comic book characters, and I kind of been going ever since then, doing the same sorts of things. So the thing that really got me into illustration, because I told you I'd loved drawing for, you know, ever since I was little, I really started noticing illustration when I started reading comic books. That was kind of the thing that really got me into illustration. And this is one of my very first comic books, The Dark Knight Returns by Frank Miller. And it's just got some great pictures in there, really like nice line work in the character, just really great drawings of Batman. And so I was really hooked. I had lots of different comic books that I loved a lot. And something that I started to notice as I got a little older, this is a book that I got when I was in college, is that a lot of these comic book illustrators that I was starting to really love, like this is Dave McKeon, did a whole bunch of really awesome comic books. He was also starting to do picture books. And that's when I really started to notice the illustrations that were going into picture books, because I was reading all these Dave McKeon comic books, for instance, and then I started to see some Dave McKeon picture books. He worked a lot with Neil Gaiman doing covers for like Coraline, and he did a bunch of picture books like The Day I Swapped My Dad for Two Goldfish. Another one of my favorite comic book artists when I was a kid was John J. Muth. He did a whole bunch of really awesome comic books like this series called Moonshadow that I liked a whole lot. And he also started doing picture books. He did these Zen short books. And so I really started paying attention to all of these amazing illustrators that I loved from comics that were now starting to do picture books, which got me in the library and started really looking at all the picture books that were coming out. I started getting other favorite illustrators that didn't do comic books, that just did picture books. This lady is one of my favorites when I was first getting started. Her name is Lisbeth Werger. She does some really amazing watercolor paintings. This is Lane Smith, does some really clever, funny picture books. And William Joyce does some fantastic books. And this is Chris Van Dusen. So all of these great illustrators I kept seeing that were really inspiring me. And as I kept going, I just kept collecting picture books. These are some people that are more current, like Peter Brown and Dan Santat and Tony DiTerlizzi and Adam Rex. All people that I really respect, and I have this giant collection of picture books at home where I'm always trying to get inspired by all these great illustrators that are doing really fantastic work. So when I was in college, I was thinking, well, maybe I should try doing some picture book stuff. I didn't know anything about it except for, buying picture books and reading them from the library and kind of, seeing the kind of stuff that I liked. So I started trying to do illustrations that I thought looked like picture book illustrations. And these are some of my very first tries. I did this series of paintings that was like a pig who was dressing up as different animals. So here there's a pig dressing up as a cow jumping over the moon. Here's a pig trying to pretend he's a chicken. And here's a pig who's pretending he's a sheep, like he's jumping over the fence like you would if you were counting sheep. So these were some of my very first attempts at doing something that I thought looked kind of children's book-like. At the same time, I was graduating from college. My wife and I, we moved to Chicago so my wife could go to grad school. And I was looking for a job. And I ended up finding a job being an art director at a children's book publisher. So what an art director and a designer does is they take all of the stuff that the writer does and all of the stuff that the illustrator does, and they put it together on the computer to make a book. So I would have a file for my book, and I would add the text in from the author. I would add the pictures in from the illustrator. I would get it all ready to print, and then we would send that out and it would go to the printer and they would print those into books. And so I did a lot of books. I worked for that company for about 6 years, making lots and lots of picture books. And I also, at the same time, was trying to get into the illustration thing because I was doing a lot of work where I was working with other illustrators, putting their books together, but I really wanted to make my own books. So I started getting little jobs. Luckily at that publisher I was working for, they did lots of different things. And so I started off doing lots of like work sketching pictures for lots of licensed companies like Disney and Sesame Street and stuff like that. The sketch on the left is a sketch I did for a Winnie the Pooh series of number cards. So the sketch is something that I did. And then we would send those sketches to the illustrator and they would make a finished piece out of it. So the actual finished drawing on the right, I didn't do that, but I did the sketch. And there was a lot of practice learning how to draw these characters. We would draw tons and tons of them. And so it was a lot of practice learning how to draw different characters from different books and getting better at drawing all these pictures and just learning how picture books are put together. I also got licensed to do Sesame Street books. So this was a Sesame Street book that I did the whole thing. I did that box and there were 4 little books that went in there. And that was a real learning experience because this is one of the first things I ever got published. And I was really excited to do it, but Sesame Street and any kind of license that has a lot of like characters that everybody knows has very strict rules about the way you draw those characters. So they have something called a style guide, which is a really thick book that they give you that shows you all of the ways exactly how to draw every single character. They give you a breakdown of all the ways, like all the different colors that go into the characters. They have very specific ways that you draw the eye shape, and they have to be the right size with the nose and the right size with the face. And so when I was working on those Sesame Street books, I did them over and over again. I would do sketches, I would send them off, and they would mark them up and say, oh, you got to fix this. You got to make this bigger and smaller. You got to make this character look more, like Elmo looks. And so that was a really good lesson in revision, which is one of the biggest things that you have to do when you're an illustrator, is especially when you're sketching, you have to do things over and over again to get it just right so everybody's happy. So the author and the publisher and the editor, everybody is happy with the work that you're doing. Because I might have an idea in my head of how to draw a character or how I want a scene to look in a book, but it's a collaborative thing. We're all working together to try and get a book done. And so it's not just what I want, it's what everybody wants to make the book just right. And so while I was doing these Sesame Street books, I was also trying to develop my own style too. I was trying to develop my own illustration style so I could do my own books. And while I was working at that publisher, every once in a while I would ask my editor if I could do an illustration here and there. And it started off with these really big books. They were like 360 pages long. They had tons and tons of fairy tales. And so I'd be like, can I do like one illustration in this 350 page book? Which didn't seem like a big deal to them, because, there's tons and tons of illustrations in there. But it was a chance for me to get like one painting in there and practice to get better at it. And it taught me a whole lot about things that work and things that don't, and how to get better at painting illustrations. This was a cover for one of those books that I got to do later on. So this is one of those 365-page books, and that's the cover illustration that I did for it. And that's where I'm kind of developing my children's book style. I also got to do some pop-up books, which was really fun. It was a totally different kind of experience, doing something that was kind of sculptural. So pop-up books were a real challenge to be able to open them up and be able to get them to close and work just right, and also be able to be made over and over again. So they're making hundreds of copies of this. So every single copy, the pop-up has to work just right. So that took a lot of practice, sitting in my office, folding paper and gluing it together, and then sending those little mock-ups off to China. And the designers in China would build the actual book that was going to be printed, and they would send it back, and we would have changes. It took a lot of work to get a pop-up book to work just right every single time. And so while I was doing all of that work at the publisher that I was working for, learning to become a designer, doing little illustrations here and there, I was always had my eye on becoming, a picture book illustrator full time. That's what I wanted to do with my life. And so I was trying to come up with lots of images that I could send out to different publishers, because that's the way that an illustrator gets work. An illustrator will do a bunch of paintings, a bunch of illustrations that show the illustration style that you want to do. And then you send those off to lots of publishers. And the publishers, the editors at the publishers, will look at your work. And if they like it, then they'll try and find a story that they think will fit with your style. So they match a story that they've gotten from an author and try and match it with your illustration style. So I came up with some fake stories just to start off with, to kind of show my illustration style. This is something that I worked on with a friend of mine, Dana, and we came up with a story, and I made some illustrations for it. And we sent it off as kind of an example of what a book might look like that we would do. This series never got published, unfortunately. It would have been really fun. It was called The Adventures of Zoe O'Leary, and we put together a letter. This was what the letter looked like, where I gave sort of a summary of what the story was and a couple examples of what the pages are. And also on the other side, there was a cover letter. And I had to write a cover letter for each publisher that I was sending it to sort of talk about the books that I liked from that publisher, and to show that I was really interested in the kind of books that that publisher was putting out, to show that I thought my book would work with them. And so after doing that for a while, it took me about 4 or 5 years after I graduated from college, sending out lots and lots of samples of illustration before I finally got the call. I was sitting at work and I got a call, and it was from Holiday House, and they said that they wanted to hire me to illustrate my very first picture book. And I was super excited. This is the first picture book I ever did. It's called Puxatawny Phyllis by Susan Leonard Hill. And it was so much fun. And it was the first time I'd ever done anything like that. So I made lots of mistakes the first time around. Those pictures that I showed you earlier, those paintings of the pigs being different animals, I painted those all on wood panels because I like sort of the wood grain look that came through. And so for this book, I painted all of these paintings on wood panels too, which I think they ended up looking really cool, but then I had to pack them all up and mail them off to New York, which ended up being really expensive and hard for them to be able to take pictures of because they had these giant wooden panels that I had done paintings on. So this is my very first book, Puxatawny Phyllis. And after I got this first book, things just started rolling. I kept sending out samples. I ended up getting an agent that started sending out more of my samples. And I just started getting more work that sort of built on itself. So after that, I got to do a series of books with Judy Cox about the same mouse character. We did 4 different mouse books. These are some books that I got to write and illustrate, which is something that I've also, wanted to do the whole time that I was doing this. It took me a long time to get to become a writer too. I'd been illustrating books for about 10 years before I ever got a story written that a publisher liked. I was sending out stories the whole time, but it took about 10 years before I wrote one that anybody wanted to publish. So it took a lot of work and a lot of trying, but it ended up being worth it in the end. These are some other books I got to do. I got to do several 12 Days of Christmas books for Ohio and also for Illinois because I was living in Chicago when I worked on the Illinois book, and then I moved back to Ohio and got to do the Christmas in Ohio book. I've also been doing a lot of books with the called Scoutmore Junior Ranger, and they're all different national parks. So it's the National Park Service is putting out these books, and these are going in national park bookstores all around the country. We're doing a whole series of them. We've done 3 so far, but we have more in the works. So far, we've gone to the Grand Canyon and Yellowstone, and also the Colorado Plateau. And here are a couple other picture books that I've worked on recently. Some chapter books also. That's kind of a new thing that I've just started doing recently. Chapter books are a very different experience because they're all black and white illustrations inside. But it's fun because the subjects are a little bit older than the subjects I'm working on for picture books. So I get to draw different things that I don't usually get to draw in picture books. So like I was telling you, I've been illustrating for a long time when I first started, but that whole time I really wanted to be an author as well. I wanted to be able to make my own picture books where I wrote the story and illustrated them. And so I've been trying to write stories and not really being able to figure out how to get a story just right. And so about 10 years ago now, I was asked by Ask Magazine. They're the same magazine that puts out Cricket and Ladybug and Spider Magazine. Ask Magazine is their science and nature magazine. And they had a running comic series in there called Nestor's Dock. It was illustrated by a guy named Tom LaBeouf. And he wanted to stop doing it. He wanted to move on and leave the magazine, and they wanted to keep the comic going. So I had done a lot of work for Cricket Magazine before, and they asked me if I wanted to take over doing the comic series, which I was excited about because I would get a chance to write, which I'd never gotten a chance to do before. But I was also a little nervous about because taking over something that someone else started is kind of a weird experience. You're drawing their characters. You know, Tom made up the characters and made up their personalities and everything. And so I was sort of trying to carry on his style and his characters. But as I started doing it, I started really thinking that maybe I should try to just make this more my own. Because I was at first really trying to copy the way that he drew and the way that he made the characters. But after maybe half a year of it, I really started to develop my own character, and I really started enjoying writing the series too. So this is how Tom drew the characters, and this is kind of how I draw the characters. It's the same characters, but it's a little bit different style in the way I draw it, and I think their personalities have evolved over time. And the fun thing about this comic series is that every single issue, every single time I do this, it's based on whatever the magazine is about. So I get the magazine ahead of time, and I read the magazine, and I try and think up a funny comic that will go along with the theme of that magazine, which can sometimes be hard. This episode was all about prosthetics, and it was really interesting because they were talking about all different kinds of ways that they make prosthetics nowadays, like making hands out of a 3D printer for someone who has lost their arm. And so I was trying to think of a way to make a funny comic about prosthetics that also was kid friendly, which is kind of hard to do. So I thought maybe I'll just go with pirates, because pirates are famous for, having hook hands or maybe having an eye patch or something like that. And so every comic is sort of like that, where I'm trying to take a topic of science or nature and try and come up with a funny take on it. This episode was all about slime. So I made one of the main characters become a slime superhero, which he had all these great superpowers that slime has, but he was also kind of gross. And this one was all about making ice cream. So it taught me a lot about writing, which was a really important thing because every single one of these comics is sort of like a mini picture book. It's got, it only has 2 pages, but it's got a lot of little frames that you can kind of think of like individual pages in a picture book. And so I was writing all these little mini stories, and it was teaching me a lot about how to come up with clever, funny stories, a different take on a subject that had maybe been talked about a lot. And also, every time I come up with a story, I have to do a presentation for a group of people, the people at the magazine, where I have to pitch them the idea. I have to tell them the story. I have to tell them the punchline, and I have to wait to see if they laugh. And that can be really hard. We do these Zoom calls, and I'm trying to sell them on an idea, sell them on a funny punchline, and sometimes they're all just staring back at me like, oh, that wasn't funny at all. And so I get to see firsthand whether a story is working well or not. And it taught me a lot about different ways to write stories that connect with people. And so we're going to be talking about illustration now, and I kind of broke it down into different little parts of the things that I think about when I'm approaching an illustration. So I'm starting off with subject. So when I get a story, and this is the script that I got for one of the books I was talking about today, Dylan St. Clair. When I get a story, it's kind of like a present. It's really exciting. I get sent just what you see here, a document in an email, and it's the manuscript for the story. And there may be a little bit of information kind of in parentheses. Sometimes the author will kind of say what they're thinking about for the image, but for the most part, it's just the story. And every time I get a new story, it's like a present because it's something completely unexpected. I've worked with a bunch of different authors, and every author writes a different kind of story. Everybody has their own point of view, their own life. And so they write all different kinds of stories. And it's really exciting when I get a new story to illustrate, because chances are it's something I've never thought of illustrating before. You know, it's whatever that person's into, and they wrote a story, and now I get to think about it, and I get to try and be into it too, so I can figure out a way to draw the pictures that go with that. So I get a story and I read it, and a lot of times there isn't a whole lot of information on how they want me to draw it. So that's why I have to think about how I'm going to approach it. And so when we're talking about subject, you want to think about how you would take a story and how you could draw that, and how many ways there is to take that same idea and draw it in different ways. So this is something I do a lot when I come to schools, when I do my school presentation, is talk about that. So let's take a really simple story, like maybe once upon a time there was a boy who wanted to see the world. So how would we illustrate that? Well, we could just read those words, there's a boy, and we could draw a picture of a boy, right? That is not very exciting though, right? And the job of an illustrator is to take a story and add something to it, to make it a little bit more exciting. So how would we do that? Well, maybe we could do something really simple, like we could zoom way in on the character, right? Now we're like seeing the boy up close, we're seeing his face. Maybe we zoomed in too far, so he's like, back up a little. But maybe we could do that, or maybe we could see where the boy lives. We could focus on the setting, so we could zoom way out, and now he's really tiny in the picture, but now we can see the world that the boy lives in, maybe the world that we're talking about. So we got this boy who wants to see the world. Maybe we could do it that way. But there are lots of different things that I like to think about when I'm starting an illustration. There are so many different parts to think about in the picture. You know, when you're reading this sentence here, we only have a little bit of information, right? We know from the words that there's a boy, and we know he wants to see the world. And that's all the words are telling me. And a lot of times when I get a story, that's all the story is telling me, is a couple sentences, and I don't know anything else. So it's my job to make up all the other stuff to fill in the story. So what don't we know? We don't know where this boy lives, right? Does this boy live in the city? Does he live in the country? We don't know what time of year it is. Is it spring? Is it fall? Is it winter? So maybe it's spring here. Maybe he's looking out his window and he's seeing, you know, a bird being fed in the nest. Or maybe it's winter and he's looking out the window of his igloo and he sees a polar bear there. What else don't we know? Well, we don't even know for sure, because the words don't tell us. We don't know that this boy even lives on Earth, right? So maybe, you know, the boy wants to see the world because he lives out in outer space. And so he's floating in his space station and he's looking out the window at the world. And that's maybe why he wants to see the world. We don't even know for sure if this boy is human, do we? So maybe he's an alien boy, or, you know, maybe he's a space bunny. All of those things are things that I get to make up. And sometimes I'll read a story and maybe the author had thought that the characters were human characters, but there have been occasions where I've read a story and I'm like, well, maybe these characters could be animal characters instead. And that might change the story around a lot. And if everybody's okay with it, I've gotten to do that before. Another thing that illustrations add to a book is emotion, right? Because we know we got this boy and we know he wants to see the world, but we don't know why, right? We don't know how he feels about that. So maybe here he's kind of nervous. Maybe he wants to see the world because he's stuck in his house and he's kind of peeking over the window. He's kind of wondering what's going on, but he's kind of nervous, right? Or maybe he's excited. Maybe he wants to see the world because he wants to go on an adventure and he wants to march down the street and you can see in the background all the places that he's going to go visit. Another thing that I like to try to do with illustrations is tell the rest of the story. So if I've got a page where I know there's a boy and he wants to see the world, well, there's a lot of other information I can add to that because I don't want to just draw what the words say. I want to tell more of the story. So we know we got this boy who wants to see the world, but we don't know what he goes to see, right? So maybe I can show a bunch of pictures where he's at the Great Wall of China, or maybe he's in Paris or Egypt. So those are just some examples, but there are hundreds and hundreds of ways that you could take the same story and come up with different ways to draw the same story, which is what I always try and think of when I start a new story, is a clever and interesting way to draw that story. So the next thing that I always like to think of when I'm starting out a book is the characters, right? Because a book really needs a good character. And it kind of depends on the kind of book I'm doing. If I'm sent a book by an author, a lot of times I have to like really think about what that author is trying to make the characters be like. If it's a story that I'm writing, sometimes I might start off with a doodle of a character. I've done that a lot actually, where I've like been sitting there drawing in my sketchbook and I'll draw a character that I think is kind of funny and I'll think I can write a whole story about this guy. So sometimes the books that I write start off with a doodle, a character that I've made up, and then I build a whole story off of that. But if I'm sent a story, I have to sort of think about the characters that the author has written and try and draw that. And sometimes it's characters that I don't know anything about. So I've done lots of books about different times in history and different cultures and different religions, things that I don't know a whole lot about. And so I have to do a lot of research for it, which is one of my favorite parts. When I get a new story and I have to do a lot of research, it's great to sort of dive in and learn as much as I can about that subject. So on the book Feast of Peas that I did with Kashmira Sheth, this is the second book that I've done with her. I did a book called Tiger in My Soup with her a couple of years back. And this is the newer one. And Kashmira is from India. And so the first story, the family, it's sort of in modern times in Tiger in My Soup. It's set in modern times, it's set in America, but the characters are Indian American. In this book, this story is more of like a folk tale, and it's set like back in the past in India. And it was a very specific time and place because she said the city that these characters lived in. And so I had to do a lot of research about the kind of clothes that people wore in this particular city, because people in different parts of India back then wore different kinds of clothes. I had to research what the actual place looked like. And so when I was trying to come up with the characters, I was trying to make it historically accurate, but I also wanted to have a lot of their personality in it because these two characters are very different. The one character is very happy. He's growing this garden with peas, and he's always like celebrating. He's excited about all these peas he's growing. But then the other character on the left is always sneaking in and stealing all his peas and eating them before the one character has a chance to pick them. So I wanted to show a lot of the different personalities in the characters, but also have it fit with the history. So I found lots of pictures of different kinds of outfits, different kinds of clothes that people wore in that area. And so you can see this is the painting for the book that goes along with that sketch. You can see there's the garden where the peas are growing. And I also had to think about the village that they lived in and the setting, because the story specifically says what city they lived in India. So I had to find pictures of that city and make sure that they were pictures from that time in history. So you can see here, there's a scene at the end where there's a big chase. The one character finally finds out who's been stealing all the peas, and he chases them through the city, and they end up at the side of this river, and there's a temple in the background, and all of this stuff is in the story. So I had to make sure that I drew all of this and make sure that it looked just like it looks in real life. So this is the illustration that I came up with, where they finally catch him, and you can see the temple in the background, and you can see the river, and all of those buildings are things that I took straight from the pictures. The other book that I've been talking about today, Dylan St. Clair, was a very different kind of story. This story I really related to a lot. I was excited to get to do this story because it has to do with a kid that's really creative, and he's really into doing all sorts of creative things, especially theater, which is something back when I was in high school I did a lot. I was in a lot of plays. And so I kind of pulled a lot of stuff from my personal memory to put into this story. So you can see Dylan here. He's in lots of different costumes. And these are some pictures from the book showing all the different kinds of dancing and singing he likes to do in the mime and all that sort of thing. And here's the big finale where he's the space squirrel and all of his friends are different planets and rockets and stuff like that. And so I had a lot of fun just pulling things that I had remembered when I was a kid being in different plays to try and add to this book. So sometimes I'm illustrating things that I don't know anything about and I'm having to do a lot of research on. And other times I'm illustrating things that are sort of personal that I know a lot about that are kind of fun to throw in, like funny things that I remember from when I was a kid. This is another book. This is a book that I'm working on right now. It's going to be out in the spring. And it's called Boo Stew. And so this is an example of trying to come up with all of the different characters for this story. So these are the character sketches for all of the different characters. And I tried really hard to make every character really unique and to go along with sort of the thing that they did, because none of these characters except for Curly Locks have a name. So it just says the blacksmith and the chicken rancher and the mayor. So I tried to give their costumes and the things around them sort of personality to go along with their story. So these are some of the sketches I did for the characters, and this is how they ended up in the book. Now, the next thing that I think about when I'm working on an illustration is style. And style is kind of the way that you draw something. And one of the things that I love so much about picture books, and one of the reasons that I have such a big collection of picture books, is there are so many great styles of illustration out there. It's really a great way that lots of illustrators can express themselves and do all different kinds of illustrations. You don't have to draw picture books in any certain way. You can draw it in lots of different ways. And these are a couple examples of books that I've been working on. I've had the opportunity, like very recently, to do a lot of books that are sort of monster related. I don't know why exactly that happened. A lot of times I'll just get books all in a row that sort of have the same sort of theme. For a while, I was doing nothing but mouse books. Right now, I seem to be doing nothing but monster books. And all of the books are slightly different. So I kind of approach doing monsters in slightly different ways. You can see over here on the left, there's this giant character, and he's holding the little girl, and he's pulling the roof off the house. That's a comic book I'm working on right now. It's called A Giant Mess. It's coming out in spring. And so since that is a comic book, I did it in a much different kind of style. I did a lot of heavy outlines with really simple flat colors. You can see the one up on the top corner with the scarecrow and the ghosts. That's from Feast of Peas. That's in the middle of the story. The one character dresses up as a ghost and he's like sneaking into the garden to steal some peas. And the other character dresses up as a scarecrow and catches him and then chases him all through the town. And so the way I painted that is very different. That's using actual paint on paper, and it's in a very sort of loose style. Now the picture on the bottom is from Boo Stew, and that's a very different technique too, because I did the illustrations. You can see on the bottom half of the illustration, there's Curly Locks, and she's making her Boo Stew. She's making it out of ingredients, all these sort of gross ingredients that monsters would like to eat. And in the story, the monsters are not called monsters, they're called scares. And so when I read that, I was like, okay, how am I going to draw a scare? What does that even mean? So I thought that maybe they could sort of be like shadow creatures. And so I tried lots of different ways to draw shadow creatures, and I ended up using this sort of ink technique where you sort of splatter ink and you spread the ink around to make lots of drips, and you can get all kinds of really cool monsters that way. So these are 3 different monster books that I've done recently, but they're all in very different styles to sort of go along with the book that I did. So you can see that's a close-up of one of the images from Feast of Peas. There's the scarecrow that's chasing the ghost out of the town. When I was working on the Boo Stew book, I did a lot of research, like trying to figure out lots of ways that I could draw the scares, these different monsters. And so I went online, which is something I like to do a lot to get inspiration, to try and see different ways that different illustrators have approached drawing monsters. And there's so many great examples out there of all different kinds of cool looking monsters. So I did lots and lots of little sketches trying to figure out how to get them to look the way I wanted, until I stumbled upon these. Which is somebody, I saw him doing a demonstration on YouTube where he was doing this thing where he was splattering ink, and then he was using this here. This is a canned air, and you kind of spray it, and it makes the ink spread around and make all these really cool patterns. He has a really different way of doing this than I came up with, but I thought it was kind of a cool technique because you get all of these sort of random patterns that you never know what you're going to get. And so I started just playing around with it, just like splattering ink on paper and sort of spreading the ink around to see what kind of monsters I got. Because all of these monsters live in a swamp, I thought that the ink drips kind of looked like branches and sort of seaweed and stuff coming out of the swamp. So these are the ink blot drawings that I did of different monsters to come up with. And so when I was working on the Boo-Stew book, I start off every book that I'm working on doing little tiny drawings called thumbnails. And sometimes I might do like 4 or 5 thumbnails for each page to try and figure out exactly the way I want it. Like I was showing you earlier, there's 100 different ways you could draw the same sentence. So sometimes I might try and draw like 4 or 5 different ways to see what's the best way. Do I want this page to be zoomed in or zoomed out? Do I want it to focus on the character? Do I want a whole lot of action going on? Do I want a big scene where you can see all the scenery? So I start off with these little thumbnails to try and figure out how I want to do it. And then I'll take those little thumbnails and I'll turn it into a finished sketch, kind of like this. Now this sketch is the full size that the book is going to be. It's like a big piece of paper, and I've got everything kind of worked out the way I want. And you can see I've even sketched in the monster kind of with shading to kind of look the way that I want them to look when I do sort of the ink. And so the next step is I took one piece of paper and I did all the ink stuff. And so I painted those monsters and I did a lot of splattering, and I used my canned air to spread the paint around. And then since you can see that this is a scene where the monsters are walking back into the swamp, they're walking like through the swamp right now. So I wanted to add some of the reflection in the water of the monsters. So I took that same picture and I copied it in a program called Photoshop on my computer, and I flipped it upside down and made it a little see-through so it would look kind of like a reflection, like they're walking in water. Now the next step is I took the rest of that sketch and I put it on a piece of paper and I did a painting like this. So this is an acrylic painting, and you can see that after I've done the color painting, I've added the ink paint, the ink part on top of it on the computer. So these were 2 separate paintings that I did that I pieced together in the computer, which is something I do a lot now. I'll do a lot of painting by hand, but then I'll also do some working with it in the computer. These are some other pages from Boo-Stew where I did lots of different sort of ink monsters. Here, Curly Locks is collecting ingredients for the Boo-Stew, and here she's at her cabin in the swamp, making the Boo-Stew for all the monsters. Here she's in the mayor's house, feeding some of the monsters that were causing trouble in town. And you can see that I made all of the monsters a little bit see-through, right? I did the color painting underneath, and then I added the ink painting on top, but I made it a little bit see-through because I wanted them to look kind of like shadow creatures. Like they weren't all the way there. They were just kind of see-through creatures. And that's at the very beginning where Curly Lock is walking from the town to her cabin in the woods. And you can see one little shadow creature hanging out on the tree up there. So when I'm talking about style, I told you there's like a couple different ways I do things. So one way that I do things is by painting traditionally. And what that means is I'll do a sketch, I'll put that sketch on a piece of paper, and I will paint I'll do painting with paint, acrylic paint on that paper. So this is some steps I can show you from a book called Click I did. I start off with a quick sketch, then I do a finished sketch at full size. Sometimes I'll add in some shading on the computer, and then I'll put that on a piece of paper. You can see here, this is a board, and I've taped it down with some blue painter's tape. And then I drew the sketch on there, and then I put a bunch of sort of reddish brown paint on top of that. I always start off a painting that way. I don't really like starting a painting off on white paper because I think when you start off sort of filling it in and making it messy, then you can go back in and add detail to it. And that brown always sort of comes through and gives all of the edges of the painting kind of an orangey glow that I like a lot. So this is the first step. I'll put the first coat of paint on there, and then I'll start adding detail to it. So this is one of the next steps where I've started adding some color to it. And I'll just keep going from there. I'll add more and more detail until it becomes a finished painting. Now, in that case, when I've got a finished painting, I will either put that painting in the mail or I'll use my scanner on my computer. But I'll take a picture of it, with my scanner, or I'll send it off in the mail to the publisher and they will scan it. So that's taking a picture of my painting. And then they will take those and add them into the computer, and they will add the type to it. So you can see here, this ring is something that's been added in on the computer. And so after I've done my painting, the picture is taken of the painting and the words are added to it. And then after that, it's printed, and then it becomes a real book. Now, the other way that I can make paintings is digitally. So this is from the Giant Mess book that I just did. And since this was a comic book, I really wanted to give it a different look. I wanted to give it kind of a comic book look. And you can see here, this is sort of a time elapse of what it looks like when I am drawing this. So I start off with the sketch. All of that sort of light stuff behind there is the sketch that I did with pencil. And then I put it onto my iPad and I draw all of those black lines in using the stylus on my iPad. So here I'm filling in all the lines. I'm adding all the boxes and the text and the little word bubbles and all of that stuff. And then I will add layers of color underneath. So I start off with flat colors, and then I start to add texture to it and highlights and shadows. And by the end, we have a finished drawing. So there's lots of different ways that I make illustrations. Sometimes I make paintings, sometimes I make digital illustrations, and sometimes I do kind of a combination of both. The other thing that I think is really important about illustration and about books that's really different than any other kind of art is time. And that's kind of a hard thing to explain, but I'll try and show it to you. When I'm doing a book cover, this is a book cover. The job of a book cover is to sort of sum up the story, to get somebody excited about picking up a book, and it's sort of supposed to tell a whole summary of the story. So you can look at this and you know that this book is going to be about kids going on an adventure with some animals, that have weapons, right? Basically, you can get that from the cover. A cover is supposed to sort of give you a window into the whole story. It's one image. You only get one picture to do that. So here we can really get the gist of what this story is going to be about. If we look at this, it's a totally different kind of story. We know this is kind of a mystery story. It's dark. There's, the flashlight. There's sort of a mysterious figure that's looming over them. So the cover is supposed to draw you in and give you an idea of what the story might be like. Now, the difference when you're doing the illustrations for a picture book or for a comic book is you have time. You're not just doing one drawing, you're doing a whole bunch of them, and they have to tell a story over time. They have to make you want to turn the page and be interested in what's coming next. And so sometimes you don't want to show the whole image. Sometimes you want to hint at what's going to happen next. So you might draw a really simple image in order to lead you to a really complicated, really, bang kind of image on the next page. So that's something that I always try to plan out when I'm doing a book, is how it's going to be paced. What is the time in that book? So I always do something called a storyboard, where I do tons of little sketches. This is from my book, George the Hero Hound. And you can see all these little sketches in a storyboard. So I can see the entire book page by page. And I know that on this page, this thing is happening. And on the next page, something exciting is happening. So maybe I need to build up to it. Or maybe I should hint at something that's going to happen later on in the book. Or maybe I've had a page where a ton of stuff is going on, so the next page needs to be kind of simpler. Those are all things that I like to think about when I'm thinking about the time in a book. So when I'm doing a picture book like Boost do, for instance, here's a series of things that happen. Here's the farmer, and he knows that there's like these monsters inside the mayor's house. And so he's rolling up his sleeves and he's going to walk in. So that's the first image. It's leading you up until when he goes into the mayor's house. And now he's confronting the monster. He's got his lasso, and he's gonna capture these monsters, and he's going to defeat them. All right. So as you turn the page, you're getting drawn into the next thing that's going to happen. So it starts off, he's excited, he's getting ready to go fight the monsters. He's in there, he's about to fight the monsters, and then he gets confronted by an even bigger monster, right? The giant monster that scares him, and he comes running out the door, and it ends with him jumping off the stairs into the swamp as the giant monster is sort of bursting through the roof. So there's a couple pages in the Boo Stew story, and you can see that in each page, it's leading you to the next thing. It's starting off kind of simple. It's starting off getting you sort of pumped up and leading to sort of like the big image where he's like running away, and then sort of the far away image of everybody looking as the monster bursts through the roof. So that's the time in a story, is turning the pages, going through the story and making the illustrations and the story sort of make you want to look onto the next page. Now, when I'm doing a comic book, there's even more of that. So a comic book is different than a picture book, because a picture book usually only has like one picture per page, right? Maybe two. But in a comic book, all of those things are happening on the same page. So this is the next in the comic series that I'm working on right now. The first book was called A Giant Mess, and it's about a giant who comes to a town and sort of uses the town as his toy box, sort of playing with all the planes and cars and stuff and making a giant mess. This next book is called Kraken Me Up. It's about a kraken. Well, it's about a little girl who has a pet kraken, and she brings the kraken to the state fair to like sort of a pet judging contest. And everybody's sort of freaked out by the kraken because it's big and scary, but it's actually like sort of a shy, friendly kraken. I'm doing this whole series of comics that are about sort of monster puns. The next one after that is called I'm Ogre It, about an ogre who sort of thinks he's too cool. This one, you can see it starts off. These are sketches. I haven't actually started doing the final illustrations for this, but you can see here's the judge that's doing the pet show, and he's looking at all the different pets. So we start off at the top of the page, and it's all very simple. He's like looking at everybody's pets. He hasn't really looked around the room yet. So he's saying, oh, this is a pretty pig. This is a fine hen. I love this llama. And then he turns around and he sees the little girl. And so you can see how the pictures build, right? It starts off with a small image that's just a close-up of him bending down, looking at the girl, holding onto a tentacle. And then he stands up and he's sort of looking straight ahead and he's saying, Itza. And you can see that the panels are getting bigger as we're zooming out. And so now we're zoomed out even more, and he's looking up and he's saying the same thing, like he's stuttering, like, Itza. And then it goes to the next page where he sees the kraken. It's a kraken. So you can see the time in these panels leading from the very simple action of him looking around and being happy at all the animals, and then it's sort of leading up to the big action where he sees the kraken. And so I'm going to show you a couple examples real quick from The Giant Mess. The story starts off where we're seeing the town that the giant is coming to visit. And there's a little girl who's sort of throughout the whole story, and she makes a big mess of her room. And her mom is like, you got to clean this room up. But she has no idea how big a mess can be made, because when the giant comes to town, the giant makes a huge mess of the whole town. So here's the giant. He's running into the town. His parents are in the background, and they're having a picnic in one of the farm fields. And I try to find lots of ways of breaking the story up into panels like a comic book, but in interesting ways. So here he's looking into a building, but every window in the building is like a different comic book panel. And we can see all the different things that people are doing in that building as the giant is sort of reaching in to grab this one guy. And he puts the guy and the little girl and that giraffe that he took from the zoo, and he flies them around in a plane. And then he doesn't want to clean up his mess afterwards. And so he throws the same kind of fit that his little sister says, where where the little girl says she doesn't want to clean up her room. The giant doesn't want to clean up his mess either. And so she, tries to teach him a lesson about how to clean up the way that she should have. So that's about it. Did we have any questions? I'm gonna stop sharing my screen.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Jeff.
Thanks.
That was super informative.
Oh, thanks.
And really entertaining too. First question. Mm-hmm. Was it difficult for you to find your own creative way of drawing and illustrating?
Actually, yeah. I think whenever anybody's starting to learn to draw, they usually copy the people that they like at first. I think that's something that people do in every case. If you're learning a musical instrument, if you're learning to write stories, which you start off by liking things. I started off wanting to be an illustrator because I loved illustration, because there are all these great illustrators out there. And so at first I was just, trying to do stuff that I thought looked like children's book illustration. And I was looking at other people's stuff and trying to do things similar. And it took time, trying things out, and just doing lots and lots of practice and work to find out exactly how I wanted to do things. And I think it's still evolving too. If you look at the books I did like 15 years ago, and you look at the books I'm doing now, I think they look completely different because over time I've come up with new ways to paint things. I'm doing things digitally now. I'm using different kinds of paint. So all those different kinds of things change the way that the pictures end up looking.
Awesome. And so what's your preferred method to whenever you're drawing and illustrating?
It really depends on the project.
Oh yeah.
I really like doing both. I like doing the digital illustration, and I like doing the painting. And I'm glad that I get a chance to switch back and forth because they're very different. They come out looking really differently, and they feel really differently. When you're making a painting on paper, it's a really physical process of painting, and it's kind of exciting. And when you're doing something on a computer, you have a lot of freedom you don't have when you're painting, because if I paint something on paper and I don't like it, like if I paint a whole background color and it takes me half a day to do, that's awful, But on the computer, I can go in and go whoop, and I can change a little button, and all of a sudden the background's a totally different color.
Right.
So that's kind of handy that on a computer you get the chance to change things pretty quickly.
Yeah, for sure. And then last question: do you ever get artist's block? And if you do, how do you kind of work through it, or how do you do do you take any measures to prevent that from happening?
Yeah, a lot of the same stuff that Tricia was saying. I take walks sometimes. That was really nice this summer when I was writing all these monster books. I did a lot of walks, and that for some reason, exercising sort of makes things pop in your head. I'm not really sure why, but it does better than just like sitting and staring at a screen sometimes. And also, I'm constantly trying to be inspired. So I'm constantly going and looking at other illustrators and reading other picture books, and trying to get inspired by the different styles that I'm seeing in illustration and in writing, to try and come up with my own ideas. So it's constantly reading and looking at books to sort of get inspiration. That's usually where I start if I can't figure out how to start a book.
Well, thank you again.
Thanks.
We really appreciate it. It was extremely informative.
Thank you. If you want to take a look at any more of my work, you can go to jeffillustration.com. And if you want to watch any of those storytime videos, go to Facebook, and it's Happen Inc. is the Facebook page where I'm doing those storytime videos.
Great. Thanks, Jeff. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you.
Well, that concludes today's session. I want to thank you all for attending. As a reminder, to find out more information about the Young Authors Conference and Buckeye Book Fair, visit buckeyebookfair.com. I'm sorry, buckeyebookfair.org, not .com. And you can also go to the Tri-County ESC Young Authors website, which has been shared with you. Again, I want to thank Ms. Springstub and Mr. Ebbeler for joining us today and providing a wonderful educational program for the students. And also, thank you, teachers and students, for joining us. Speaking of, don't forget to fill out your class certificate of participation form, teachers, on the Tri-County ESC Young Authors website. You'll get that form emailed to you momentarily after you've completed the form itself. You'll get the certificate emailed to you, and then you can display that. And that's good for, you can do that for any class that views any of these videos. You'll just click on this for teachers here and fill that form out. So on behalf of Buckeye Book Fair and Tri-County ESC, I want to say thank you. Hope you enjoyed the program and have a wonderful afternoon.